Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. A very good afternoon or morning, depending on where you are, to all of you. This is the fourth in a series of 5 conversations about the world in transition. During the last 3 sessions, we had a thorough discussion of the importance of transitional period, a historical perspective, a conceptual perspective. We talked about the dangers of miscalculations and the benefits of correct predictions. Then we had a discussion about characteristics of the transitional period. We talked about the length, that it may be a very lengthy transitional period. Here I should say that we cannot say that today transitional period has started and at a certain date it has ended. Long before the transitional period officially started, that is, the collapse of the Soviet bloc, we could see signs of the fading of the old system and the move into a new phase. That could be seen. And long after, we will have almost an idea of what the next order will be. There will be some turbulences still. But one of the important characteristics is competition and turbulence. Turbulence during the transitional period will be massive. Competition will be severe. But it will continue. It's not that when a new system sets in, we won't have turbulence. Fluidity and fluid coalitions is one aspect of this transitional period. We also talked about changing globalization and the fact that many public goods have become globalized, including, most notably, security. And because security has become globalized, we talked about the end of zero-sum games and the fact that zero-sum games will end in negative-sum outcomes. We even saw a short animation about that. I also indicated that in the real world, in spite of the negative consequences of zero-sum games and positive outcomes of positive-sum games, you do not expect players to play positive-sum when others are playing negative-sum or zero-sum. And that is why we will have a perpetuation of the outdated paradigm of exclusion and zero-sum, or what we call Cold War mentality, that your gain is my loss, and vice versa. We've had brief moments of positive-sum games. We talked about 2 instances in which I had the experience. The dialogue among civilizations and the nuclear deal or the joint comprehensive plan of action. And we also talk about resistance to both because of vested interest in zero-sum approach. We discussed how paradigm shift was not just necessary but inevitable. Whether and at what cost and when that paradigm shift will come about depends on all of us. Whether as human actors, because we also talked about human beings becoming global actors, and we will discuss that probably a bit more. It depends on whether individuals as global actors, human beings as global actors, how much we will take our own future into our own hands, rather than succumbing and submitting to what we call realities. Because we make realities. There is, in international relations, in any human endeavor, there is no predetermined outcome. We determine the outcomes. The players determine the outcomes. Nothing is predetermined. We make history. Of course, there are rules of cause and effect. Of course they are. But we make those causes. It's not as if we are prisoners of these changes. So this perpetuation of the old paradigm does not need to continue. If we make a change, if we make a decision for a change, we're not prisoners. We're not prisoners of any situation. The paradigm shift is inevitable because of a number of reasons, which we started last week. We will continue this week, and we will end our discussion with why all these changes have led to the end of hegemony. We talked about the diversification of sources and centers of power. In that, we talked about both material sources of power, which in themselves have become diversified. In the past, it used to be only military, then economy, then technology. And then we talked about ideation of sources of power. We also talked about multiplication of power players, power actors. And the fact that human beings have become global actors because of the internet, because of social media, because of viral pieces, whether quotes, animations, or whatever, becoming viral over the internet. And then last time we did start to talk about the shift in power centers. We discussed how during a period of time, long period of time, everything which was of any significance was either taking place in geographical and political West, or the geographical and political West had a determining control over what happened. May have happened in Africa, may have happened in Asia, but the West had a controlling influence over what happened. That was the monopoly of the West in the practice of international relations, but also in the theory of international relations. In fact, the theory of international relations that I know is not just Western, but American. The United States has become the theorizing force, the intellectual force behind shaping the conceptual approach to international relations. IR is basically an American science. And that is a reality. Now we're dealing with a new reality. The new reality is that this monopoly is fading. Again, as I said last week, and I will have to repeat today, because we are used to thinking in the extremes, it does not mean the West is dead. It does not mean the US is unimportant. The United States will continue to play an important role in international relations for the foreseeable future. But there are a number of factors that are contributing to an emerging reality. That reality has not set in, but that reality is moving in a very clear direction. Again, let me point out that history is not predetermined. Players can change this course. Players have tried to change this course. As we discussed in the past sessions, the attempt by the United States to securitize international relations during the 90s and early 2000s was a conscious attempt to prevent this trend in the shift in power centers and the West and the United States losing hegemony. But because of the mistakes and miscalculations that they made, it actually expedited that trend. It actually made it faster. Now, why is the Western monopoly ending? Well, most of you watched what happened in the Security Council a couple of nights ago. Well, there have been cases, even during the Cold War, particularly during the Cold War, that the United States had to resort to veto alone. Many cases. But you have not seen any case, at least I haven't seen any case, in my own experience in the UN, past 40 years, or in what I've read about the UN, that the US would present a draft resolution, not be forced to deal with one that somebody else presented, but present a draft resolution which only one country joined the US in supporting. That is a colossal development, a generational development in international relations. It could not have been conceived, even in theory, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. Now, it does not mean that an agreement, JCPOA, or a Security Council Resolution 2231 destroyed the power of the United States. But it did mean that in a globalized world, in a transitional period in the world, the United States' power will not determine the course of events. Now, some analysts, because they cannot believe this fundamental shift in international relations, are looking for excuses, saying, what's behind this? Why did the US present a draft that would lose? And certainly there will be something else. Of course there will be something else. The United States will try to reverse the previous resolutions and bring them back to life. That would fail too. That will fail too. But why does it do it? Because old habits die hard. Because the United States, a year and a half, 2 years ago, started basically a timetable saying that in 700 days Iranian arms will be open. No more restrictions on Iranian arms purchases and sales. And the clock was ticking from their perspective. So they boxed themselves, not recognizing, as I said in the first meeting, miscalculations are prevalent by everybody. It's not just exclusive to smaller and medium powers. The United States can make that mistake. The United States tried, came up with a 35-paragraph resolution, tried very hard, moved to a 4-paragraph resolution, With the 35 paragraph resolution, it could have gained 1 vote. With the 4 paragraph resolution, it still gained 1 vote. That indicates that the nature of challenges are becoming global, and the responses to these challenges are becoming global. And the fact is that big powers will not have an automatic acceptance by others. No longer automatic. They certainly have more ability to move, to build consensus, if they play their cards right, than others. But if they do not play their hand right, then they can lose. Unless we change our mentality, we cannot predict what will happen. And then when something happens, we try to find basically conspiracy theory explanations for something that can be explained by very clear and very obvious rules. So developments are global. The West is not capable of addressing those global challenges by itself. It needs others. The Secretary of State has to fly to Dominican Republic in order to express the appreciation of the United States. It does not mean, as I said, it's the end of power of the United States. I think last week in the discussion about norm setting, I talked about the United States and the International Criminal Court. The United States was opposed to International Criminal Court. But because of the European insistence and coalition building, short-term coalition building on International Criminal Court by Europe that included some countries in Africa who were basically motivated by the frustration of the genocide in Burundi, and also supported by Latin Americans who were motivated by criminal gangs, no state could deal with, and they all wanted a higher body to deal with it, and Europe was capable of bringing all of them together in order to pass the statute of the ICC against the objection of the United States. But does that mean that the United States will send its, will find its troops sent to the ICC for criminal trial and investigation? No. But it means that the United States, just like Secretary Pompeo going to Dominican Republic, it means that the United States will have to go to 160 countries and sign bilateral treaties with them in order to prevent its soldiers from being taken to the ICC. So these developments, changes in the global climate, force major players to concede some of their power, to play in a different environment. And unless they understand it, they end up with one vote. They did not expect that. Why didn't they expect that? Because they didn't understand the transitional realities of the transitional vote. In addition to others, arrogance is another reason. And lack of professionalism. Using people as foreign ministers and ambassadors who have no experience in foreign affairs and in diplomacy, believing that diplomacy and foreign affairs are just a game that you need to wear nice clothes or look nice and then use your national influence. These are also additional reasons. But the main reason is changes in the global system, because chronism is nothing new in domestic affairs. There is a relative decline of traditional power relative ascendance of emerging powers, and the end of major power monopoly. Some of us still try to explain global developments in a contest between major powers. Many of us, even theoreticians and academics, try to explain whatever happens in the international system as a consequence of some either contest or cooperation between major powers. I think that line of thinking needs to be shelved. That still doesn't mean that major powers don't play a major role. But what happens around the world is not the outcome of major powers playing together. Let me give you one example. On September 9th, 2016, September 9th, 2016, John Kerry, Secretary of State of the United States, stood next to Sergei Lavrov, Foreign Minister of the Russian Federation, two global powers, and announced a US-Russia deal on Syrian ceasefire. According to CNN, and I'm quoting, "Today, we are announcing an arrangement which we think has the capability of sticking, but it is dependent on people's choice." End of quote. This was what Kerry said. At least he was aware enough to say that there is another factor other than the global powers working together. Between September and December of 2016, we had some of the highest casualties in Syria, most serious conflicts and confrontation in Syria. The two powers, two global powers, came together and announced a ceasefire. Highest casualties following that announcement. Then what happened? On 20 December 2016, foreign ministers of Russia, Turkey, and Iran announced Syrian talks in Astana. 20 December 2016. Only 3 months after the failed agreement between Russia and the United States to establish ceasefire in Lebanon. From December of 2016 till today, this is the only game in town. The only game in Syria is the Astana talks. We've had the mini Western group. We've had the big Western group. We've had many others participating in groups attempting to impose or influence the outcome. When I went to Davos, World Economic Forum, in the beginning of 2017, every single politician and diplomat was against Astana talks. From the United Nations, from the special envoy of the time of the United Nations, to anybody else. Nobody wanted it to succeed. Nobody. Because, not just because they didn't like Iran or Russia or Turkey, but because this was the ushering in of a new concept. That is, no longer the major powers can determine global developments. In areas where major powers failed, and that was not the first time. Major powers started in 2012. They appointed Kofi Annan. He failed. They appointed Lakhdar Brahimi. He failed. They appointed others. They all failed. They had meetings everywhere. They had meetings. I participated in some international Syria support group. They had the Montreux meeting where they disinvited Iran from participating. They had all sorts of meetings. They failed. But three countries, not on the same wavelength, each having different perspectives, were able to play an active role. And if you say these three countries controlled everything in Syria, I would beg to differ. Because there were groups that were paid by other countries. There is a change. We now have reduced hostilities in Syria. We have started a political process. When the Astana process announced the formation of the Constitutional Committee, nobody was in favor of it. Everybody believed it was a hoax. Because the West is used to thinking that it is the only source of presenting lasting solutions. That if it comes from anywhere else, it has ulterior motives. And therefore, they would not welcome it. But it has had sessions. Nobody expects a war that has lasted 11 years to reach a peaceful political outcome in 10 weeks or in 20 weeks or in 1 year. But it's moving where no Western initiative, no major power initiative could have moved. There's similar situations in Africa, where the organization of African unity has been much more effective. I'm not creating a utopia where regional organizations are playing an active role, but it has been much more effective in dealing with various problems than even the United Nations. So we have actually moved into a post-Western era. It's not antagonistic towards the West, as I said last time. It's not anti-Western chauvinism. Because in today's international relations, global relations, this type of chauvinism will only end up damaging your own interests. But it's a reality. I don't know whether I mentioned this. Munich Security Report, the Munich Security Conference, which is the foremost Western security conference, started in the 1950s. And it's still held in the same hotel in order to keep that historical sort of aroma or aurora of the 1950s. It's a very small place, a very uncomfortable place. It started producing a report every year prior to the conference. In 2016, it was the first report. The title of that report, I read you the title, Munich Security Report 2016, Boundless Crises, Reckless Spoilers, Helpless Guardians. Of course, who the guardians are? The West. Who the spoilers are? Non-state actors, emerging powers. And boundless crises. This was the title of the 2016. You see the grudge. Now, the next year, it's even heavier grudge. Munich Security Report 2017. Post-truth. post-West, post-order. That's the title of the 2017 Munich Security Report. 2020, Munich Security Report 2020. You know what the title is? Westlessness. The state of having no West. That is, the West, there is a process of disintegration in the West. West is acting against the West. Maybe it started in the 1990s with the United States pushing for securitization while the Western European countries were pushing for norm setting, and there had clashes of interest. And then the height of it was what they called the Second Gulf War. From our perspective, the Third Persian Gulf War, that is the war against Iraq in 2003, when you had basically France and Germany becoming U.S. enemy number one. Any of you who watched U.S. television during the 2003 war, you saw that in U.S. Congress, they no longer called French fries French fries. They called them what? Freedom fries. That was the type of confrontation that we had between Western countries. Now, most in the West believe that the current administration in the United States is undermining, if not destroying, the Western conception of the liberal world order. So they believe the United States is undermining what they and the United States for the past, whatever, half a century had tried to build. So the state of disintegration in the West has led to a situation where the West is no longer there. As they said, helpless guardians. The state of Westlessness. Now, these are the situation on the ground. The situation on the ground is that the West is conceding that they do not any longer control what's happening around the globe. That is why the guardians have become helpless. But are there conceptual developments? It's very difficult for the West to accept a conceptual development. That is still, IR theory emanates from the West. And IR theory emanating from the West, I mean, we cannot forget the normative role of a theory. Theories are not simply explanation tools. Theories do not just try to explain or even predict. Theories are normative tools. They create an international environment. They don't just explain what's out there, but they create a normative framework for what ought to be out there. And as long as non-Western theories, non-Western conceptual formations of what will happen in the future are not given a possibility, and those of us in non-West are not capable of articulating our approach to international relations, our norms, our ideas, our conceptual framing of the future of international relations, I do not believe we can reach a theory that can explain, even explain, the realities of international relations. This takes me to our last topic for the day, and that is end of hegemony. What I have said up till now, if you just put it together, you will reach the conclusion yourself that hegemony is no longer possible. Not just no longer desirable, not just something that people in the rest of the world resent, but no longer possible. What did we talk about? We talked about power shift. We talked about power shift from Atlantic to Pacific, from traditional powers to emerging powers, from West to post-West. We now have come up with multi-centers of power. We don't have a uni-center of power in the global community. We have multi-centers of power. And we have many contenders. Many newcomers are contending for power. Not only has the West lost monopoly over power, the state has lost monopoly over power, which is one step higher than the West losing monopoly. Emergence of non-state actors, non-state global actors, as we discussed last time, in the field of economy, in the field of information, where individuals can become non-state global actors, in the field of culture, and most importantly, in the field of organized violence or war. We now have non-state actors. We may have had them local, regional. Now we have non-state global actors, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, similar organizations. We have had case after case of major hegemonic powers failing to achieve intended results. Case after case. Now, this has been a long process. It started with Vietnam. But something interesting. The only case where the United States can claim that it achieved its intended outcome from a military confrontation is what? Grenada. The U.S. invasion of Grenada achieved what it intended. Bring me one other example where the U.S. military intervention has achieved the intended results. It has failed. So the failure of the hegemons, or the hegemon, whichever you prefer. We've had hegemons, and we had for some time a claimant to being the only hegemon. But they failed to achieve intended results when they intervened. And then, as we discuss and as we see today, we have multifaceted global challenges that not even the biggest powers can address. During our first session, you remember we talked about Corona, and we see the challenge of Corona bringing to their knees a small, tiny, unseeable virus which cannot live on its own, has to be a parasite, has to depend on a host to live, has brought the greatest power to its knees. But other than that, terrorism. I think I said here what happened after September 11th. If you walked in the streets of New York, people were paranoid. You had a beard, and they immediately called the police. If you had a beard in New York and looked at a big building or started taking photos from the subway They immediately called the police. Immediately. Because they were paranoid. Biggest power, spending 600 billion US dollars a year on military, could not provide security to its own citizens. And then we also had another development of failed or failing states, be it in Somalia, in Africa, in Afghanistan. Failed or failing states became an outcome of mostly hegemonic interventions. Dealing with these had a huge cost. The economic cost of maintaining a hegemony is huge. Impossible to bear for any hegemonic power. The economic cost led to political cost. No public opinion poll in the United States shows any segment of US population having preference for US intervention abroad. There are, for instance, Trump's base in the US may have that inclination, but they are only 30% of the US population. The majority in the United States and everywhere else which played a hegemonic or global position have a tendency not to approve of those adventures. And then hegemons had impossible tasks. They started intervening, and then they had failed states in their hands. As Colin Powell once said in the Security Council, you break it, you own it. They broke societies. They owned it. They had to start a process of nation building. Nation building abroad is not an easy task. Dealing with local sensitivities, grievances, historical rivalries, they found themselves in the middle of a quagmire. In the age of global information, they could not use a local mercenary or a local lackey or a local agent or whatever you want to call it to control the population. They tried. When they invaded Iraq, they first wanted General Garner to have a military government in Iraq. They found out that it didn't work. They asked Bremer. Then they asked the governing council. Then they saw what happened in the next 17 years. Nation building, if you break it, you own it. And that became problematic. They also faced what was only natural, and that was local resistance and resentment. And resentment led to extremism, as we discussed. So hegemonic tendencies created huge costs. Political costs, military costs, economic costs, legitimacy costs. Let me quote something for you. Humility in international affairs will earn respect abroad. But arrogant actions will earn resentment. End of quote. Can you even guess who said this? This statement was made on October 12th, 2000, by no one other than G.W. Bush in his presidential debate with Al Gore. Humility in international affairs will earn respect abroad, but arrogant action will earn resentment. Very, very deep, very wise, but he got himself involved in he got the United States involved in the worst resentment of history, creating Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda existed, creating ISIS, creating Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, who was the father of ISIS in Iraq, and whatever that, Afghanistan, you now see that after some 19 years, they are negotiating with the same people they try to overcome in order to find a way to escape Afghanistan. The most important objective of the United States today in Afghanistan is to get out at whatever cost. Hegemony is expensive. Hegemony is no longer feasible. Not desirable, it's no longer feasible. This led to unmet expectations in the West, and that led to extreme nationalism in Western Europe and two competing trends in the United States. Isolationism. Trump started with an isolationist approach, saying that let Iran deal with Daesh, their worst enemies, and ended with a unilateralist approach. These two competing trends which sometimes converge. And we now need global action. But there is both a unilateralist tendency that would destroy the United Nations, as we have been seeing and we will continue to see in the next few weeks, and there is a real fear, even among the big five, the permanent five members of the Security Council, that you will see a disintegration of the Security Council if the United States continues with its so-called snapback situation. It's a very nightmarish scenario for a lot of people. But there is another very unfortunate development. As global hegemony is fading, some regional powers believe that they can fit in. And they can become regional hegemons. The wars in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, all of these, Lebanon, all of these are because some newcomers who did not even have a hope of playing a global role, like our neighbors in the UAE, now are extending their hands, going well beyond their capabilities, interfering in Yemen to Libya, to Somalia, elsewhere. This is because the vacuum of a global hegemony, caused because hegemony was no longer feasible, is enticing, tantalizing smaller countries which never could have imagined playing a more than national role into trying to become a regional hegemon. The fact that the United Arab Emirates has established diplomatic relations with Israel is nothing new. They always, over the last few years of the transitional period, believed that they can become the Israel of this region, that they could have a small, effective army like Israel, so that they could intervene, so that they could play a hegemonic role. Regional hegemony, by whatever power, will have no better future than global hegemony. It works against the realities of the global situation. It creates tendencies and momenta that would be extremely difficult, certainly not for regional hegemon wannabes, but even for traditional global hegemons to control. They've tried their luck, they failed. That's why they're withdrawing. That's why the United States is withdrawing from Afghanistan. It's because they were not able, that hegemony does not work anymore. Now, if somebody in the region believes that they can replace the United States in any of these countries and become the new regional hegemon, badly mistaken. That is why I'll discuss next week the policy of Iran in light of these realities, and that is to have a strong region rather than a strong man in the region. Thank you.